Hi, I'm Victoria, your host of Eyes on Crime. Today I'm walking you through one of the most confusing cases that I have ever researched, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. This isn't just another missing persons case. There are surveillance cameras, there are clear timelines, there are eyewitnesses, and yet, to this day, no one can explain how Brian walked into a bar on March 31st, 2006 and was never seen again. Not one confirmed sighting, no physical evidence, no explanation. To really understand this case, we need to start at the beginning. Brian Randall Shaffer was 27 years old, a second-year medical student at Ohio State University. Friends describe him as charming, funny, and friendly, the kind of guy who could turn a stranger into a friend in minutes. But there was more to Brian than just the easygoing all-American med student image. In most photos, he was clean-shaven and well-groomed, but over the years he'd gone through phases where his hair was longer and he looked more disheveled. It's a small detail, but it gives you a glimpse into how much his appearance and maybe even his mindset shifted from time to time. And then there are details about Brian's life that don't always get mentioned. For example, a couple of years before he disappeared, Brian had a DUI. He was also known to smoke weed occasionally, though there's no mention of him ever using hard drugs. None of this suggests anything sinister, but it does show that Brian wasn't just the perfect student or the guy everyone loved. He was a multidimensional person like anyone else. Brian was extremely close to his mother, Renee Shaffer, who was one of many nurses in the family. She had always wanted him to go to medical school, and Brian, in return, wanted to make her proud. He initially spent time in Puerto Rico for educational purposes and loved it. In 2005, he returned and spent as much time there as he could. While it may have been for academic reasons, that time only fueled his dream of escaping to a more relaxed, carefree lifestyle. But Brian's true passion wasn't medicine, it was music. He dreamed about starting a band and living a laid-back beach life inspired by Jimmy Buffett. He even had a Pearl Jam tattoo on his upper right arm. Brian was struggling academically more than people realized. Despite being a medical student, some close to him later admitted that he had considered other career paths. In fact, Brian had seriously thought about leaving medicine altogether. His grades weren't stellar, and there were concerns about whether he would continue medical school. Brian's girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, was also in medical school. His mom had bought them a spring break trip to Miami, and Brian planned every detail. They were supposed to fly out on Monday, April 3rd. Some have claimed that Brian was planning to propose on that trip, but the proposal rumors? They weren't true. Renee had asked a friend for a jeweler recommendation, but there's no sign Brian ever followed through. No visits to a jeweler, no purchases, nothing. And truthfully, Brian had a reputation for being a flirt. People close to him say he was a bit of a ladies' man. This detail becomes important later on. But before the trip could happen, tragedy struck. Brian's mother, Renee Shaffer, passed away after battling a rare cancer called myelodysplasia. They were incredibly close, and her death shattered him. But even through the grief, Brian was still making plans for the future. He was sad, of course, but no one saw him as hopeless or suicidal. That said, some things were off. Brian was an hour late to his mother's funeral, which deeply hurt his family. His relationship with his father and brother wasn't as close as his bond with his mother, and after her passing, tensions within the family started to surface, especially over money. Just before her death, Renee changed her life insurance policy, splitting it 50% to her husband, Randy, and 25% each to Brian and his brother, Derek. Randy, however, was shocked. He had believed the kids weren't supposed to receive anything. He even suggested that Derek could keep $1,000 but should return the rest. The argument over the money became so heated that Derek skipped dinner with Brian the night he disappeared to avoid the conflict with his dad. Another often overlooked aspect of Brian's life was his financial situation. While in medical school, he supposedly relied entirely on his father financially. His tuition payments came from his dad, and for the next semester, the check, over $4,000, was due on March 27th. But Brian never turned it in. There was no attempt to cash it either. It's a detail that's hard to ignore. It makes you wonder, was he putting it off? Or had he already made up his mind about something he hadn't shared with anyone? At one point, Brian even asked Alexis to run away with him and start over somewhere else. She thought he was joking, but looking back, this might have revealed how serious he was about wanting to escape his current life. With all of that in mind, his dreams, his grief, his doubts, let's go to the night everything changed. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, the first day of spring break, Brian had dinner with his dad, Randy, at Outback Steakhouse. This wasn't just any dinner spot. Outback was Renee's favorite restaurant. Only about 3 weeks had passed since Brian lost his mom, and even though he was grieving, he wanted to spend time with his dad before his trip to Miami. Randy later noted that Brian appeared slightly tired from exams, but otherwise seemed normal. At one point, Brian told his dad, "It's all right, Dad. I'll be with you as much as I can." They talked about the upcoming trip, hugged goodbye, and made plans to see each other the next day. That was the last time Randy ever saw his son. After dinner, Brian met up with his close friend, Clint Florence, a former roommate and drinking buddy. They had lived together for a year, but Brian eventually decided to get his own place. It seems their friendship had gotten strained for reasons that weren't entirely clear, and Brian seemed to want some space. Before we get into that night, I need to tell you a bit about the area. The South Campus Gateway was a lively but unpredictable part of Columbus, packed with bars, restaurants, and student housing. It was a popular hangout for Ohio State students, but it also had a dangerous reputation. In the 1990s, this area was riddled with crime and drugs. By 2006, redevelopment efforts had cleaned it up to some extent, but it was still rough around the edges. Even Columbus police admitted that the 6-block walk between the bars and Brian's apartment wasn't the safest at night. It wasn't uncommon for students to get mugged, assaulted, or worse. The area's reputation wasn't just old stories. It was something people actively worried about. Students knew to stay aware, travel in groups, and avoid walking home alone whenever possible. With that in mind, let's talk about where Brian was that night. The plan for the night was simple: bar hopping to kick off spring break. Around 9 p.m. to 9:15 p.m., Clint arrived at Brian's apartment on King Avenue. They started at the Ugly Tuna Saloon around 9:30 p.m., a popular bar in the South Campus Gateway area just off High Street. In an interview, Clint said they sat down, opened the tab, and, had 3, 4, or 5 shots of liquor. Alexis, who was visiting her family for the weekend, checked in by phone and called Brian at 10 p.m. Later, she recalled, "He didn't sound worried at all. He wasn't upset or depressed. He sounded completely fine." She also mentioned that Brian told her he was using the night to talk to his friends about her. After that call, Brian and Clint continued their night out. Around 11 p.m., they arrived at Short North Tavern, where they had a couple more shots and kept the night going. By 11:45 p.m., they made their way to Brothers Bar and Grill, where Clint's girlfriend, Meredith Reed, joined them. Throughout the night, Brian was talking on his phone with several friends: Matt, Graham, Brandon, and Jeremy. They had been playing phone tag, trying to coordinate meeting up. That's why, at 1 a.m., Meredith drove Brian and Clint back to the Ugly Tuna so Brian could meet up with the friends he had been trying to connect with all night. At 1:15 a.m., surveillance footage shows all 3 of them coming up the escalator to the bar. That's Brian, leaning on the handrail. Once inside the bar, Clint recognized one of the girls, Brighton. He'd been a teaching assistant in one of her classes. Her friend Amber was with her. Clint had never met Amber before, and Brian had never met either of them until that night. According to Clint, Brian jumped into conversation after conversation and looked totally at ease the entire time. Clint later said, Brian was doing his usual thing and was talking to those 2 girls. Brighton later shared that Brian had been flirting heavily with her. She even said she put her number into his phone, and at one point he kissed her neck. The bar itself was small, the kind of place where, on a quieter night, you could see from one side to the other without much effort. But on a crowded evening like this, a sea of bodies, dim lighting, and the constant motion of people moving between tables and the bar could make it difficult to track someone at a glance. At 1:55 a.m., Brian supposedly told Clint he was going to talk to the band and walked off. But that's not what happened. Surveillance footage shows Brian stepping outside the bar near escalators at the top of the landing to talk to Amber and Brighton. 2 uniformed police officers can be seen in the background as they chatted. At 1:57 a.m., Brian can still be seen standing with Amber and Brighton. Around 1:58 a.m., the 3 of them walk off and back towards the bar. Brighton went back inside to use the restroom while Brian and Amber stayed near the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Next to the bar, an office space was under construction. A temporary faux wall had been put up to block it off. Brian and Amber were standing right beside that wall, directly under the security camera, waiting for Brighton to come back from the restroom. But because of how that camera was angled, it couldn't see what was happening directly below it. Essentially, they were standing in a blind spot. There was another camera positioned at the top of the escalator facing the main entrance, but it didn't cover the corner where Brian and Amber were standing either. Some reports claim another camera caught Brighton returning from the restroom. The three said goodbye and the two women walked off. At 1:59 a.m., Brian stepped slightly out of frame. But if that footage exists, it's never been released to the public. Either way, that was the last confirmed sighting of Brian. At 2:01 a.m., Clint and Meredith were seen on camera leaving the bar via the escalator. It was closing time, somewhere between 2 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. Brian was nowhere to be found. Clint and Meredith later told police they had called Brian's phone and checked the bathroom, but when they couldn't find him, they assumed he had already left. Surveillance footage captured them exiting the building and heading into the parking garage. Then they drove to Clintonville, about 30 to 45 minutes away, where Clint was house-sitting for a professor. Meredith later confirmed she stayed there, and police verified they didn't return to the area that night. So the question is, if Brian didn't leave the bar with them, then where did he go? Brian had a history of occasionally disappearing for short periods or getting himself into tricky situations. A couple of years earlier, he'd gotten into a bar fight over a sports team, a heated argument that turned physical. It wasn't some deeply concerning pattern, but it was enough that his friends knew he could sometimes run his mouth or end up in the wrong kind of conversation. Because of that, Clint didn't panic when Brian vanished that night. He assumed it was possible Brian had taken off on his own, maybe to blow off steam or even walk home. On Saturday morning, around 10 a.m., Meredith drove Clint back to Brian's apartment so he could pick up his car. At that point, no one was worried. Brian was known to stay out late, and after a night of drinking, it wasn't unusual for him to sleep in. Later that morning, Brian was supposed to help his dad, Randy, with some chores. When he didn't show up, Randy assumed he had overslept or made other plans. It wasn't concerning at the time. After all, it was the start of spring break. Meanwhile, Alexis Wagoner had been trying to reach Brian all day. She called and texted repeatedly, but every call went straight to voicemail. At first, she thought his phone had died or that he was just busy recovering from the night before. By the end of the day, her concern turned into full-on panic. By Saturday evening, Alexis reached out to Clint and asked him to check Brian's apartment. Clint was Brian's former roommate, so he either still had a key or knew where one was hidden. He spent hours there waiting for Brian to return, but there was no sign of him. Nothing in the apartment suggested Brian had come home at all. The bed was untouched, there were no signs of recent activity, and everything appeared exactly as it had before he went out Friday night. His car was still in the same spot, so wherever Brian went, he didn't drive. On Sunday, Alexis drove back to Columbus. Around 6 p.m., she arrived at Brian's apartment and decided to call Randy. Derek also showed up. That evening, Alexis and Randy reported Brian missing, but Columbus police were slow to respond. They said Brian was a grown man, it was spring break, and they should wait until Monday to see if he showed up for his flight. When Brian missed his flight to Miami, the case finally shifted. Police began reviewing surveillance footage, not just from the Ugly Tuna, but from nearby bars and businesses as well. Brian is clearly seen entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. He's seen again at 1:55 a.m., chatting with the two women outside, but the police stated he's never seen leaving. For years, media coverage has led people to believe there was only one way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. But that's simply not true. The building had multiple exits. Yes, you could exit via the main entrance, an escalator leading down to the main door, but it wasn't the only way out. There was a fire exit and a service elevator likely intended for employees, but still a potential route out. The structure also housed several businesses, each with its own doors, meaning someone could have slipped out through another establishment and never been noticed. A side door was occasionally propped open by patrons stepping out to smoke, offering yet another way someone could have left without being caught on camera. As for the security coverage, it was far from reliable. Some cameras weren't working, others had blind spots, and to top it off, one of the officers reviewing the footage admitted to overriding camera angles to focus on women he found attractive. The truth is, there's no way to say for sure that Brian didn't leave the building. The idea that he vanished into thin air inside the ugly tuna rests on flawed footage, missing angles, and a lot of uncertainty about the exits available that night. Remember the construction area I mentioned earlier, the one right next to the bar, filled with debris, open pits, and unstable scaffolding? That site became a major focus in the search for Brian. Police brought in cadaver dogs, used thermal imaging, and conducted extensive physical searches. They went over that space meticulously. But in the end, they found nothing. No blood, no clothing, no trace of Brian at all. The Columbus Police Department claimed to have meticulously reviewed all surveillance footage related to Brian Shaffer's disappearance. In fact, one officer even stated that he projected the footage onto a wall at life-size dimensions, believing this approach would enhance his ability to identify individuals. However, enlarging low-resolution video in this manner typically results in diminished clarity, making it more challenging to discern facial features or details. Even with modern technology, zooming in often leads to a loss of image sharpness. The idea that one officer spent hours reviewing footage on his own time just doesn't sound believable. The officer also claimed to have identified every single person who entered the bar that night and left. Every one of them. Then came the admission about 30 people exited through doors not covered by surveillance. Brian wasn't seen on any footage leaving, but he wasn't the only one. Here's the thing, several others slipped out without appearing on camera. Then in September 2006, months after Brian's disappearance, something strange happened. Alexis called his phone just as she had been doing every day since he went missing. But this time, instead of going straight to voicemail, the call rang 3 times before disconnecting. For a moment, hope flickered. Was Brian alive? Had he just turned his phone back on? Alexis called again. 3 more times, and each time it rang. She asked her brother to try too, and his call rang as well. She contacted the detective working the case and told Brian's dad. Friends and family started texting the phone, hoping for anything, a reply, a sign, something to hang on to. The ringing continued throughout the night and finally stopped sometime between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. on Saturday. It didn't ring at all that day. Then on Sunday morning, it started ringing again, and this time it continued all day. Investigators traced the signal and found that the call had pinged a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, about 14 miles northwest of Columbus. The idea that Brian might still be out there sent a wave of speculation through both the public and law enforcement. At first, authorities suspected it was just a routing glitch, but what really raised hopes was the fact that Brian's voicemail had been functioning all along, which meant the account was still active. That made sense. Alexis had been paying his phone bill ever since he went missing, but hearing the phone ring after months of silence still felt like something had changed. Eventually, investigators and the phone provider explained that voicemail staying active wasn't unusual. Even if a phone is lost, turned off, or the bill goes unpaid, voicemail can still work because of how network systems and billing cycles are set up. The moment that sparked so much hope was ultimately downplayed, explained away as nothing more than a technical issue. Police interviewed everyone, bartenders, customers, and the 2 women Brian spoke to outside. Nobody had answers. Clint and Meredith were questioned too. Meredith agreed to a polygraph and passed. Clint refused. He was the only person who declined the test and immediately hired legal representation. After that, he cut off contact with Brian's family and never cooperated again, not even when subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. Then in 2008, tragedy struck again. Brian's father, Randy, was killed by a falling tree branch while cleaning up storm debris. After Randy's death, someone left a message on his online obituary guest book that read, "Dad, I love you. Love, Brian." Police tracked it to a public computer in Franklin County but found no useful leads. It was just a cruel hoax. With Brian still missing and Renee gone, Brian's younger brother, Derek, became the only surviving member of the Shaffer family. After Randy's death, Derek hired Don Corbett, a private investigator, but eventually fired him, highlighting ongoing tensions and frustrations within the family over how the case was handled. In 2016, Columbus police officially said they could no longer rule out the possibility that Brian could still be alive, but they admitted it was just as likely that he wasn't. In 2018, police discovered a huge mistake. Brian's DNA and his father's DNA, collected back in 2006, had been mislabeled by Columbus police and were never entered into CODIS. If Brian's remains had been found before then, they would never have been identified. And that's not the only error in this case. Police have long claimed they reviewed every second of footage and never saw Brian leave the bar. But that might not be true. Years later, HLN aired a real-life nightmare special that featured surveillance angles the public had never seen before. Viewers slowed the footage down, took screenshots, and what they found raised serious questions. In one moment, Brian looks over his shoulder, clearly aware of the nearby police, and discreetly drops something into Amber's purse. It's subtle, but it's on camera. Even more shocking, there's a man walking down the stairs who looks a lot like Brian. Same body type, same hair, same clothes. We can't say with 100% certainty that it's him, but a lot of people believe it is. And if that really is Brian walking out the front door, caught on camera and footage detectives claim they reviewed nearly 2 decades ago, then I honestly don't know what to say, because that would mean this entire investigation began with a massive oversight. Initially, Brian's family and friends did everything they could, putting up flyers, searching dumpsters and alleys, and even combing the nearby river. They hired private investigators. They begged Clint to talk. Nothing worked. However, since his father's death, it seems as though a lot of this work has fallen on close friends and web sleuths. Kelly Bruce has spent years researching Brian Shaffer's disappearance, uncovering pieces of the puzzle that most people have never seen. After the original investigator stepped away from the case, she was given access to 3 months of Brian's phone records, something almost no one outside law enforcement has had. That, along with his bank and credit card statements, revealed some strange activity. Brian's credit card debt, nearly $15,000, was completely paid off just 1 month before he vanished, but there's no trace of that payment in his bank account. And here's what's hard to explain. Brian didn't even have a job at the time. He was also receiving monthly checks for $425 from the same account, each with sequential check numbers, and once made a cash deposit of over $5,000 at an ATM in Pickerington, Ohio. Where was this money coming from? Who was sending it? Kelly's work has kept this case alive, even as CPD has grown silent. And what she's uncovered raises serious questions about what might have really been going on in Brian's life before he disappeared. To this day, no trace of Brian has ever been found. Investigators have explored every possibility, an accident, a voluntary disappearance, or foul play, but none of them fully explain how Brian could disappear without a trace. Did Brian leave that bar on his own? Did someone make sure he never walked out? Or is there a possibility we haven't even considered yet? One moment, Brian was there. The next, he was gone. And almost 19 years later, we're left with the same question. How can someone just vanish without a single clue left behind? Some people still believe Brian is alive. But if that were true, and law enforcement knew it, they'd be legally required to close his case and remove him from the NCIC database. As of today, he remains an active missing person in the national system. If you know anything about Brian Shaffer's disappearance, call Columbus Police at 614-645-4545. And if you have a theory, leave a comment below. What do you think happened to Brian Shaffer? I read every comment, so I'd really love to hear your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. It really does mean a lot. I'm still new to podcasting, and your support helps more than you know as I grow this channel. Thanks again for listening to Eyes on Crime.